I'm here today to talk to you about meaningful engagement and to really begin to peel that stinky onion and see what's inside of it. Engagement, everybody slices this thing so many different ways. Engagement is psychological, it's emotional, it's social, it's cultural, it's educational. Engagement does this, that, and the other thing, and it's always made so complicated and so deep. Researchers talk about it like it's like the holy grail of our work. No matter what your work is, you have to engage the people. In the meantime, I walked into a craft store the other day. I have an 11-year-old daughter. I'm very engaged in her life. I walk into this craft store with her. We're walking through an aisle, and there's a sign right here, right above these gift cards. The sign says engage, and it's pointing to the gift cards. Stores are using engagement. This is amazing to me. But what does it mean? What does it practically actually mean? So I had to slice this. I had to get to the middle of it. And what I've come to is very simple. An engagement is a sustained connection that a person has to something in themselves or outside of themselves. That's it. An engagement is a sustained connection that a person has to something in themselves or outside of themselves. So we can be engaged in playing sports, and some of us are. We can be engaged in playing piano, and some people are. We can be engaged in the conversation with the person next to us. We can be engaged with, that beautiful person who you're going to marry and spend all your life with. You see? It's that sustained connection. That engagement happens all the time. The young people that we work with, we kind of do them a disservice every now and then because we say, you're not engaged. We need to engage you. And as a fact of the matter, they are engaged. They're just engaged in things that we don't value or validate. They're engaged in so many things. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Or sports, or school. Or negative behaviors that challenge their social well-being. But they're engaged in them all the same because they have that sustained connection. The key word, the operative word, becomes meaningful. How do we form and help young people form meaningful engagement throughout their lives? First thing we have to decide and understand, nobody gets to decide what meaningful is for me. The same thing is true for you. Nobody gets to decide what meaningful is for you. The same thing's true of our board members who are trying to engage in our board work to help lead our nonprofits. The same thing is true of donors who we want to reach out to and get them to give more money in more effective ways. The same thing is true of the parents of the young people that we work with. The same thing is true no matter who we're trying to engage, where, when, or why. So how do we get that meaningful engagement? About 15 years ago, I worked for Washington State's education agency as their first ever student engagement specialist. My whole job was to spend 3 years researching student engagement in schools. Now, 15 years ago, I don't know what you remember, student engagement was a non-conversation in schools. No Child Left Behind was the conversation because that's when it was brand new. Right when it was rolling down the hill, it was this gigantic lead ball, and I'm holding up a sheet of glass that says student engagement. And it was rolling down the mountain. Anyway, I lasted 3 years. And in those 3 years, I had a chance to collect 3,000 examples of young people saying when they were engaged in schools. And in those 3,000 examples, I found a series of patterns emerge. And in those patterns, I found one especially that speaks to this more than everything else. I want to share with you what that pattern is. It's a really simple pattern that many of you probably already know because you do it by intuition. But it's also a really complicated pattern because we don't do it on purpose. We often do it by accident when we do it the best. And when we don't do it, we know it. So the pattern's really simple. It has 5 steps. The 5 steps are things that you do every day in every way. I bet it already. But now we're going to surface that pattern. We're going to call it out. And we're going to send you home with it as something that you can do, an action that you can take to foster meaningful engagement. The first part of the pattern, the first step, is very, very simple. If you want to meaningfully engage somebody, you must listen to them. That's all. Now, the thing about working with young people is that when you ask adults, how do you engage youth? They say, you listen to them. And then that's it. Then they'll be engaged. That will be enough. And that's a really interesting idea, but engaging young people requires more than listening. It needs some more behind it. So that's what the rest of the steps are going to be. After listening, That second thing comes in, that second step. And that second step, it's not tricky. It's something that we do whenever we go shopping and you get that card punched and then you go to the parking lot and you get your car out of the parking lot and you hand that ticket over. You get validation. If you want to meaningfully engage people, first you listen, second you validate. And that validation can take a lot of forms. Sometimes it means saying yes, but not all the time. We made this mistake back in the old days where we thought that youth empowerment meant saying yes to youth whenever they ask for something. Oh, you don't like the color of the room? Let's paint it. Oh, you don't like the way the program's operating? Let's change it. Oh, you don't like the shape of the building? Let's tear it down and build a new one. We don't do that. That's not real. What we found is that we set up young people a lot by saying yes all the time. It's true no matter who you're trying to engage. Nobody wants to hear yes all the time. Sometimes they need to hear no, including young people. Sometimes they need to hear no, including donors. Thank you, Vu. Including a lot of people. Sometimes they need to hear no. Sometimes they need just more inquiring questions. Ask more questions because that is validating. But in some way, you're saying to that other person, I hear you, I see you, I know what you're saying, or I want to learn more. That's validation. That's that second step. The third step is when it starts getting deep, this meaningful engagement. But it's not really. It's relatively simple. It's deep and simple. Is that an oxymoron? Anyway, the third step is authorization. Now, when I think about the word authorization, I go to its root word, author, to be able to tell your own story. We live in a hierarchical society. That's the way this thing goes right now. It's not perfect. Actually, we're trying to break it down and rebuild it from a different perspective. And I hope that that's what a lot of our work and our missions are all about. But if you're reinforcing that hierarchy, actually, if you're just operating in it, you have to work with it because it is what exists. From that perspective, if we want to engage another person, we must authorize them, give them the ability to tell their own story. Whether that is a child in an after-school program, a youth in a homeless runaway dropout prevention intervention program, a board member at a meeting, a politician who's here for a photo shoot, no matter who it is, we must in some way authorize them. That authority can happen in a couple different ways. It can be an informal position. Hey, can you share what you think? Suddenly you have an informal position. Sharing what you think. That's a position. It can be through knowledge sharing. Hey, what do you need to know in order to share what you think? Well, you need to know how to turn on the mic. That's authority. That's authorization. So when we're looking to meaningfully engage people, we listen, we validate, we authorize. Now, well, the awesome part about working with young people, there are many awesome parts, is this next step in the cycle of engagement. This next step is the fun one. And when you go to young people and say, how do you want to be engaged? They say through action. They want to do something. And action's the fun one. Action's the one that looks so cool. But if we don't take those steps up to action, we are not going to make that meaningful engagement as deeply as young people themselves know that they want it and know that they can have it. So taking that action is very, very important. And then the final step in this cycle, the fifth step, is reflection. Looking back on something and deciding, what did you learn? What difference does it make? And what are you going to do now? Connecting all that together, you go back to listening again. The more times you go around that cycle, the deeper the cycle gets, the deeper the engagement gets, the more you change your lives and the lives of other people. One of the greatest lessons that I've ever learned about this cycle is that it's not just about engaging others, it's about engaging ourselves. And another reason why I stand indebted to Karen is that she showed us some ways to do that. So I want to thank you all for your time today and I want to leave you with this story. It's very, very simple. It's about a farmer in a field. Again, 3,500-year-old stories. I'm liking these lately. It's about this farmer in this field, and he has this field that he just had chopped down. See, his grandfather passed away, and he gave this grandson this field, but it was covered in trees. And he knew that his grandson wanted to be a farmer, so in his will, he stipulated that the grandson had to cut down all the trees that he could. So the grandson comes in, and he has the lumberjack cut down all the trees that he could. But there's one tree in the middle of this field that's left, and it's this knotty, craggy, old, long, tall oak tree. And it's knotty. It's just all twisted and stuff. And the lumberjack won't touch it because it's not straight and perfect like the rest of the trees were. They were all tall pines and they could easily be turned into boards and used for wood. But this craggy old tree, they're just like, I'm not going to touch it. So this grandson who inherited the land calls up his dad and says, Dad, what do I do about this tree? The dad says, well, let me come down there. So the dad comes down and he looks at the tree and he says, and the grandson says, what do I do about this knotty, craggy old tree? And the father says, take a look right over there. Do you see that trailer that you put up? And the grandson says, sure. He says, do you see that cat outside that trailer? He says, yeah. He says, that cat has a really good purpose. If you want it to catch a mouse, it can get really low to the ground. It can circle around that mouse from a lot of directions, and it can pounce and get that mouse no matter what. He says, all right. He says, but if you want to, you could sneak up behind that mouse at any point, pick it up, and the cat's totally distracted, and we'll forget about the mouse and move on. He says, okay, what does that have to do with my tree? The father says, stay with me. Look over in that field, the next field over. Do you see that old bull standing in the corner? He's like, sure. He says, that old bull has a purpose. Look at it. He says, okay. He says, the father says, in the snow, that old bull is going to stand there and protect the field. All right. In the rain, that old bull is going to stand there and protect the field. Sure. When it's icy or when it's hot, that old bull is going to stand there and protect the field. He says, all right, I get that. He says, but if you ask that old bull to chase a mouse, forget about it. It's worthless. Oh, okay. What does that have to do with my tree? He says, look here. Come here. Walk with me underneath this branch. And it was this craggy old branch sticking out. He says, in the middle of a rainstorm, when it's just beginning, you can stand underneath that branch and stay dry. The guy's like, oh. He says, oh, look over here. Stand underneath this branch. In the middle of a hot, hot summer day, you can stand underneath this branch and get some shade. He's like, all right, all right. He goes, go to this branch. So they go to the last branch. He says, look at the way this one twists. Follow it from the bottom all the way to the top. Do you see the knots? Do you see the branches sticking out from it? He says, this is the one where when you don't really know something and you really want to think about it, you can stand there and just kind of stare at the tree and it'll share with you its answers because it's a giving tree. God's son says, yeah. That story is the story of engagement. We can all make these sustained connections because we all have our purposes. And that's what I've been here to share with you about. Thank you.